So now we are moving to our next session. Here we would like to take a different angle in the ESG. We had a really deep dive in green finance and ESG, but now we will tackle the Z of ESG, and we will try to look what can Chinese and Greek ancient philosophers teach us about leadership. We are very honored to have Professor Walker. Professor Walker is Professor of Humanities of Yale-NUS College, and he's an author of Aristotle on the uses of contemplation. And also we had an honor to have as our discussant after Professor Walker's presentation, Professor Zheng Shui, I hope I pronounced correctly. Professor Zheng is Professor of Organisational Behaviour and Program Co-Director of Leadership Development Program at CEIBS. So Professor, I will stop sharing my screen so you can share your presentation.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much. I would like to thank Eleni Petri from CEIBS, Professor Zheng Shui for offering comments later tonight after my talk, and everybody else tonight who is attending tonight's Impact Week event and who's played some role in organizing the events for this week. There's a lot going on. As Eleni suggested, I teach and research ancient Greek philosophy and comparative ethics at Yale-NUS College. This is my first talk to MBA students, and you all know a lot more about ESG and green bonds and blockchain than I do. So I'm not going to hide in those trees. Instead, I'm going to zoom out and look at some matters of the forest. I'm going to focus my talk tonight on a topic that I think might be of interest to many of you interested in the governance aspect of ESG, as well as to people in a variety of other domains. This is the topic of leadership and what it requires. And I will explore this topic tonight by reference to two thinkers whom I always find insightful, namely Socrates and Confucius. And I should say a word about why I'm focused on Socrates and Confucius, aside from the fact that this is an area, they are thinkers whom I study and do research on in my own work. Well, first of all, this is the China-European International Business School, and these are major figures from Europe and from China. Secondly, these are world historical intellectual figures, and as such, they inform the way that we think. They inform some of our background assumptions today. At the same time, they are very ancient thinkers. And so being temporally distant, they enable us to look at our assumptions perhaps in a fresh way from a new perspective. So let me share my screen now. The name of my talk tonight will be Socrates and Confucius on Self-Cultivation for Leadership. And I'll be focusing especially on this topic of self-cultivation in leadership and the views that Socrates and Confucius bring to it. So I want to begin with a bit of a plan for my talk tonight, and I'm going to start with a big question. According to two influential ancient thinkers, Socrates and Confucius, what does leadership require? I'm going to focus on two main works tonight in thinking about this question, and a few different key thinkers and key figures. I'm going to focus on Socrates, the philosopher I just mentioned, and a character named Alcibiades in a Platonic dialogue called the Alcibiades, where Socrates has a conversation with this character, Alcibiades, and conveys the thought that leadership requires wisdom and virtue for deciding, advising, and acting well. Having done so, I will turn to Confucius in the Analects, where Confucius suggests that leadership also requires wisdom and virtue, namely for inspiring others and managing affairs with ease. Both of these works then raise a question about how we, as the audience of these works, can possess wisdom and virtue if we are going to be leaders. For Socrates and Confucius, leadership requires a kind of self-transformational self-cultivation. And so I will be exploring some Socratic and Confucian approaches to the question of self-cultivation. And from there, I will end with a few points for reflection. Today, I want to begin by introducing our cast in the dialogues I'll be talking about. First, we have Socrates, who is perhaps the most influential thinker in Western or European history. Socrates lived in Athens. He was not an especially wealthy man. He walked around barefoot in the town marketplace. As Cicero, a later Roman figure, later suggested, Socrates was the first philosopher to bring philosophy down from the heavens and to set it up in the cities and households of human beings. In other words, Socrates was concerned not with especially abstruse questions about the nature of reality, although he did address those. Rather, Socrates was especially interested in ethical questions, questions about how we should live and what kinds of acts we should perform. Socrates, as you may know, was also executed by a jury of his peers in Athens in 399 BCE. There are lots of reasons for this, and I'll probably get into one or two of them in my talk tonight. Still, Socrates, despite his end, managed to transform all subsequent Western thought after him. One reason perhaps why Socrates did meet the fate that he did was his friendship with and connections to our second character tonight, Alcibiades, who lived from around 450 BCE till around 404 BCE. Alcibiades came from an aristocratic family. He was extremely talented, deeply charismatic, and a very glamorous figure. He had a bright future as a leader in Athenian politics, but he also seems to have been a bit of a narcissist and perhaps a bit of a psychopath. He ultimately brought ruin to Athens when Alcibiades led a military expedition to Sicily as part of an effort to conquer Sicily during the Peloponnesian War, which was a long-standing war between Athens and Sparta. As a result of the failed Sicilian expedition that Alcibiades led, Athens ultimately ended up losing this war to Sparta and was crushed. Alcibiades, despite his bright future in leadership, ultimately was assassinated. I'm going to turn to our third cast member, Plato, who lived from 429 to around 347 BCE. He began his life as a poet, but then he met Socrates, who had a decisive influence on the rest of Plato's life. In fact, the story goes that Plato got rid of all of his poems after he met Socrates and turned his life to philosophy as a result. Plato is most famous to us today for having written a set of dialogues, philosophical dialogues, that feature Socrates as their main character and protagonist. Through the dialogues of Plato principally, we have some sense about the thought and deeds of Socrates, although I think we should also assume that Plato's dialogues are largely fictionalized. Finally, last but not least, we have Confucius, Kongzi, who lived before all of these other figures in the age, the period from around 5 to 479 BCE. He was and is perhaps the most influential Chinese thinker in history. He lived during the spring and autumn period, during which time the rulers of various states within China sought control over all of China. This was a period of great tumult and conflict, and Confucius spent his time traveling around from state to state, meeting leaders, trying to offer advice for how to lead and how to bring peace. He did not have an easy life, and in fact, he felt as he was passing on that his life had been sort of a failure. Nevertheless, like Socrates, Confucius's teachings have shaped the history of the world after him. So we're going to start by looking at some themes in this work, the Platonic Alcibiades. So in antiquity, if we wanted to begin reading Plato, Philosophers would say that the Alcibiades was the ideal place to start. If we, the dialogue is an introduction to many themes in Plato's thought. It introduces us to many themes in the thought of Socrates. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, this was the dialogue where you would begin studying Plato. Since the 19th century, there have been some debates about the authenticity of this work, whether it was in fact by Plato. Now, today, however, generally, though not uniformly, scholars do accept that this was a work of Plato's, and those scholars who do not agree that Plato was the author of this, nevertheless, this was a Platonic work, a work that is from within Plato's academy. The reason why the dialogue has fallen under some suspicion about its authenticity is that it is a fairly acceptable dialogue. And so in the 19th century, a certain German scholar thought that it was too elementary to be by Plato. Most scholars today disagree. This dialogue begins with Socrates approaching Alcibiades as Alcibiades is about to enter public life. Alcibiades will be advising those whom he leads as an aspiring politician. So Socrates confronts Alcibiades. He says, "You're going to advise the Athenians because it's something you know better than they do, aren't you?" What would you reply to that question? Alcibiades says, "Yes, I would suppose I would say it is something that I know better than they do." Socrates says, "So it's on matters that you know about that you're a good advisor." Alcibiades says, "Of course." Alcibiades, then, it seems, needs wisdom about the matters on which Alcibiades, as a future leader and advisor, counselor, advice giver, will be offering advice, including matters of war and peace and the business of the city more generally. In particular, Alcibiades, as a political leader, will be offering advice about how, on whom, and when it's better, that is, when it's just, to keep peace and wage war. So Alcibiades requires wisdom, it seems, about the nature of justice, along with other kinds of wisdom that he'll require in offering his advice. If so, we face a question. Does Alcibiades actually know justice? Does he possess that wisdom? If Alcibiades possesses knowledge of justice, it seems, he had to have learned it sometime. He either learned it on his own or he learned it from his fellow citizens. On the one hand, Socrates suggests, Alcibiades did not learn this knowledge on his own. Even as a little child, when he was playing games, without ever having sought out any knowledge of justice, Alcibiades thought he knew when other kids were cheating him. So he never at any point seemed to seek out what the nature of justice was when he was but a child. On the other hand, Socrates also suggests Alcibiades did not learn what justice is from his fellow citizens. After all, his fellow citizens disagree about justice, and people who disagree about a topic are not the sorts of people who we might think are the best and most reliable authorities on that subject, Socrates suggests. Socrates says, or asks Alcibiades, are we to say that people understand something if they disagree so much about it? Alcibiades says, obviously not. So it seems that Alcibiades lacks knowledge of justice, or at least we're led to ask how Alcibiades would know justice if he didn't learn it when he was a child and if he didn't learn it from other people. If so, it seems that Alcibiades lacks the part of the wisdom that the leader requires. It seems then that Alcibiades is planning to enter a leadership role in Athens before he's ready. He presumes to know the matters about which he'll be advising the citizens of Athens when, in fact, he doesn't know. In fact, Socrates puts this point rather dramatically. Good God, Alcibiades, what a sorry state you're in. I hesitate to call it by its name, but still, since we're alone, it must be said, you are wedded to stupidity, my good fellow, stupidity in the highest degree. Our discussion and your own words convict you of it. This is why you're rushing into leadership before you've got an education. So in offering advice on matters about which he seems to be ignorant, Alcibiades faces peril. Without knowledge, Alcibiades is apt to err greatly. He's apt to make a mess of things. When people don't think they know how to do something, Socrates says, they hand it over to somebody else, right? Alcibiades agrees. So the sort of people who don't think they know how to do things make no mistakes in life because they leave those things to other people, namely the things that they know that they don't know how to do. Alcibiades says that Socrates is right. Then Socrates asks, well, who are the ones making the mistakes? Since it's not those who know, and it's not those who don't know and know they don't know, is there anyone left except for those who don't know but think they do know? Alcibiades admits, no, they're the only ones left. In other words, those who make mistakes are those who possess a certain kind of self-ignorance, thinking that they know, but actually not knowing. Alcibiades, at this point, tries to respond to Socrates' suggestions. Perhaps Alcibiades merely needs to know what is advantageous, not what is noble or just. Alcibiades notes that the Athenians and the other Greeks rarely discourse which course is more just or unjust. They think that sort of thing is obvious, so they skip over it and ask which one would be advantageous to do. In fact, though, what's just is not the same, I think, as what's advantageous. Many people have profited by committing great injustices, and others, I think, got no advantage from doing the right thing. In short, Alcibiades suggests that what is advantageous is one thing, what is noble and just is another thing, but those are two separate categories. One needs to know only what is advantageous, not what is noble and just. Socrates responds to Alcibiades' bifurcation of the advantageous and the just in two ways, and I'll just review some of the exchange briefly. On the one hand, Socrates suggests perhaps the noble and the advantageous are not so easily separated. Consider another type of good or another type of virtue, namely the virtue of courage. Courage, Alcibiades admits, is noble, but Alcibiades thinks that courage is disadvantageous, at least for the person who suffers injury in a courageous action. Alcibiades also thinks that if life would not be worth living without something, then that thing is one of the greatest advantageous goods. It's one of the things that makes life worth living after all. But Alcibiades thinks that life would not be worth living without courage. If you were to be a wimp, so to speak, for your entire life, you would be living a life that is not fully admirable and fully desirable. Hence, Alcibiades admits that courage is one of the greatest advantageous goods. And in doing so, Alcibiades contradicts himself. Noble goods, like courage, are not necessarily separable from what is advantageous after all, it seems. Socrates offers another response to this thought. Socrates suggests that what is just and what is advantageous might not be so easily separated. People are successful through the acquisition of good things, Alcibiades affirms. And if something is noble, then that thing is good. Alcibiades agrees. And justice, Alcibiades has already suggested, is noble. So justice, it seems, is good. But if something is good, then that thing is advantageous, Alcibiades accepts. And so it seems that justice is advantageous as a good thing. Alcibiades reluctantly agrees to that point, but in doing so, Alcibiades contradicts himself. What is just is not separable from what is advantageous. I will leave it to you to think about these exchanges on Socrates' part. I think we could raise questions and doubts about whether the reasoning would go through. The point, however, is Alcibiades, in his conversation with Socrates, comes to the conclusions through the kind of question and answer method that Socrates brings to the table. Perhaps Alcibiades has another way to maneuver out of the thought that Alcibiades requires wisdom and great knowledge. Perhaps Alcibiades doesn't require any special wisdom. Maybe Alcibiades' natural ability suffices. Alcibiades says if his competition were educated, then anyone who wanted to compete with them would have to get some knowledge and go into training, like an athlete. But as it is, there's no need to train and go to the trouble of learning. I'm sure my natural abilities will be far superior to theirs. After all, Alcibiades was a man of great natural talents and great personal charm. Perhaps that would enable him to lead well. Socrates says no. Why? Because Alcibiades is outmatched in ability. Perhaps Alcibiades' natural abilities could help Alcibiades to be a leader in some way or other, but Alcibiades overlooks the competition that he faces, not within Athens, but outside of Athens. He overlooks his competition from abroad, from Sparta and from Persia, not merely within the city walls of Athens. Alcibiades asks naively, who else have I got to compete with? Socrates says, that's a fine sort of question from a man who thinks he holds himself in fine esteem. Alcibiades is suffering from tunnel vision or myopia. Socrates suggests that Alcibiades is outmatched in ability when we consider the competitors from abroad. And here he notes that if the mother of the king of Persia, Alcibiades, is attempting to compete against her son, she would laugh at Alcibiades. Good looks, height, birth, wealth, and native intelligence, considering all that they have of these things as well, namely the Spartans and the Persians, she would conclude that we were stark raving mad to think that those would suffice for Alcibiades' success. In other words, natural abilities are shared widely. Moreover, Alcibiades overlooks competition from the well-educated youth of Persia and Sparta, who receive a comprehensive education in wisdom and virtue, and who make the effort to develop their own natural ability. Socrates says, if you care to consider the self-control and the decorum of the Spartans, their confidence and their composure, their self-esteem and their discipline, their courage and their fortitude, and their love of hardship, victory, and honor, you'd consider yourself a mere child in all these respects. So Alcibiades' competition from abroad far outstrips Alcibiades' actual developed ability. In short, Alcibiades lacks what the leader needs. He lacks relevant knowledge and wisdom about what is advantageous, about what is just. Alcibiades lacks the other relevant virtues and abilities such as moderation and courage, all of which are conducive to good decision-making and good acting. I want to now turn to the Analects of Confucius. Confucius, like Socrates, also offers advice to aspiring leaders. And the primary work where we have information about Confucius's views and teachings is the Analects, the Lu, compiled by later students, in which Confucius appears as the master. Again, this is his advice is aimed at kingly rulers, rulers in politics, but I think his points apply to questions of leadership more generally. I begin with a passage from Analects 2:1, where the master said, one who rules through the power of virtue, or de, is analogous to the pole star. It simply remains in its place and receives the homage of the myriad lesser stars. Here we have a beautiful image of the model of leadership that Confucius recommends. We can call this wu-wei leadership, non-acting leadership, or a kind of effortless action in leadership. Here he compares the leader or the ruler to the pole star, who leads or rules the other stars, but not by imposing order on those other stars, but simply by being the pole star. The other stars pay homage to this better star, the pole star. The effective leader is a bit like the pole star. He should, or she should, remain in place and receive the homage of the myriad other figures whom he or she rules. The master said, if you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. If, however, you guide them with virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, the people will have a sense of shame and will rectify themselves. In other words, you should not rely on top-down sanctions and micromanagement. You shouldn't rely principally on punishments and penalties. Instead, you should guide them with virtue by being an example that they can live up to, by being an inspiring example that will, like a magnet, draw them toward your plans. Ji Kangzi asked, how can I cause the common people to be respectful, dutiful, and industrious? The master said, oversee them with dignity, and the people will be respectful. Oversee them with filiality and kindness, and the people will be dutiful. Oversee them by raising up the accomplished and instructing those who are unable, and the people will be industrious. Again, set a good example, and you will enable people to live up to their own best potential. Likewise, you should act so that those near to you are pleased and those who are far from you are drawn closer. In running an organization, if you're a virtuous leader, people will want to, the right people, the people you want, will want to work for you or will want to be in an organization rather than in your competitors if you are indeed a virtuous person who acts in this virtuous way and who can lead in this virtuous manner. Thus, virtue is never solitary. It always has neighbors because it attracts people to it. Confucius's approach in a nutshell then holds that excellent leadership should not impose, it should attract and inspire. A leader's reliance on top-down measures and sanctions is a sign that the leader is off track. Virtue is that attractive power by which leaders inspire those whom they lead. Hence, the leader requires virtue, in particular the virtue of Ren, humaneness, but also wisdom, sure. The leader then should be a noble person, a junzi. The junzi, the master said, wishes to be slow to speak, but quick to act. It's not a person who talks a lot, who talks a good game, but it's somebody who acts a good game. What qualities does the junzi manifest? The master said, Master Zheng, all that I teach can be strung together on a single thread. Yes, sir, Master Zheng responded. After the master left, the disciples asked, what did he mean by that? Master Zheng said, all that the master teaches amounts to nothing more than dutifulness tempered by understanding, taking serious one's roles and responsibilities in the duties one has by occupying those roles, but also exemplifying a kind of sympathetic understanding for other people, being able to put themselves in the shoes of other people. For Socrates and Confucius then, leaders require wisdom and virtue. For Socrates, they require that wisdom and virtue for expert performance, to decide, to act, and to advise well and with expertise on behalf of those whom the leader leads. For Confucius, leaders require virtue and wisdom to bring out the best in those whom they lead. They thereby lead through non-action. Question, however, how can we become wise and virtuous then? Socrates, in his conversation with Alcibiades, this question naturally arises. To lead, Alcibiades needs to cultivate himself. Very well, Socrates says. What do you propose for yourself, Alcibiades? Do you intend to remain in your present condition or practice some self-cultivation? Without cultivating himself, Alcibiades risks choosing and advising badly and being a failed leader. If you fall short in diligence and skill, Socrates suggests, then you will fall short of achieving fame in Greece as well as abroad. But what sort of self-cultivation does Alcibiades require? Can you show me the way, Alcibiades asks. What you said really sounded true. Socrates responds, yes, but let's discuss together how we can become as good as possible. Well, it's not clear that they actually do go on to discuss how to become as good as good as possible in the rest of that dialogue. And but we do get some initial sense of what Alcibiades needs to do. He needs at least, first of all, to know himself. if he's going to cultivate himself. Alcibiades is not his body, strictly speaking. His soul or psyche uses his body as an instrument. Alcibiades is not his property, like his house or his wealth. Those are items that benefit his body. So Alcibiades, it seems, is most of all his soul, his psyche or his psyche, whatever it is that today we might say psychology studies. Therefore, Socrates suggests the next step is that we have to cultivate our soul and look to that. How exactly should we cultivate our soul? How should we cultivate ourselves? Socrates, some of his conversation partners note, doesn't give us a lot of information about how to proceed. Here's a complaint from another character in a different Platonic dialogue, the Cleitophon. Cleitophon says to Socrates, if you're finally ready to stop exhorting me with speeches, I mean, if it had been about gymnastics that you were exhorting me, saying that I must not neglect my body, you would have proceeded to give me what comes next after such exhortation, namely an explanation of the nature of the body and of the particular kind of treatment this nature requires. That's the kind of thing you should do now. In other words, give me a program. It doesn't seem, Socrates, that you do that. You just tell me that I should cultivate myself. So what, practically speaking, should I do? Perhaps Socrates can respond by saying that simply participating in dialogue can play a certain role in cultivating oneself. Maybe simply through conversation, Socrates directly moderates Alcibiades' rashness. Perhaps Socrates directly makes Alcibiades more reflective through conversation. But we might want more details. And as we found out, Alcibiades was not a successful leader. He was responsible for his own personal disasters, but it seems Socrates' attempt at dialogue with Alcibiades didn't ultimately transform Alcibiades. So what else might ancient thinkers suggest we do for self-cultivation? Here I turn to Confucius, who construes self-cultivation as a kind of self-polishing and self-beautification. Zheng said, an ode says, as if cut, as if polished, as if carved, as if ground. Is this not what you have in mind? The master said, Zheng, you are precisely the kind of person with whom one can begin to discuss the odes. Informed as to what has gone before, you know what is to come. 2 points. Notice the focus on cutting, polishing, carving, and grinding. Take it that this is a metaphor for the kind of activity that we are to perform on our own characters. If we are going to transform ourselves from whatever we are when we come into the world to becoming a fully virtuous, wise person, then we require a kind of work on ourselves, a kind of cutting, polishing, carving, and grinding to beautify ourselves. And a second point about this passage is its reference to the odes, a set of Chinese poems written from around 1000 BCE to a few hundred years later. The odes are especially important for Confucius. And so that gives us one way of thinking about how self-cultivation might work on a Confucian picture. First practice of self-cultivation is reading. The master said, the odes number several hundred, and yet can be judged with a single phrase. Oh, they will not lead you astray. In other words, paying attention to great works of literature and poetry can play a certain role in shaping our sensibility and shaping our character, in beautifying ourselves. Well, how? Here at 320, the master said, the cry of the osprey expresses joy without becoming licentious and expresses sorrow without falling into excessive pathos. That is that certain kinds of poems embody models for how we might ourselves feel or respond to situations. Good poems can temper our emotional responses so that we feel joy without becoming licentious, right? Becoming sort of lustful, where we can experience sorrow without becoming overly sorrowful. The thought is that by exposure to a wide variety of literary works, we can refine our ways of feeling and reacting. Second set of self-cultivation practices includes ritual and music. The master said, a man who is not good, Ren, what has he to do with ritual? A man who is not good, what has he to do with music? Here we get to a key practice by which Confucius thinks that we can become good, namely the practice of ritual, which often is accompanied by music. If you think of certain kinds of public ceremonies, there is a ritual performance accompanied by a musical performance. But we can think about ritual as extending throughout our lives to many domains of ordinary practice. Think about writing a greeting to somebody by email. If you simply write your message without saying, "Dear so-and-so," sometimes your letter or your email correspondence will have a certain kind of roughness to it. And so we have a ritual practice of greeting people with "Dear so-and-so," expressing a certain kind of sympathy and a certain kind of humaneness. So by other kinds of rituals, shaking hands, bowing, going to funeral ceremonies, and much else, we develop a practice by which we can begin to feel well and act well. Moreover, so that provides a certain kind of instrumental role for ritual in making us good. Moreover, the performance of those rituals can be ways by which we intrinsically are benevolent to other people. So shaking hands or bowing might be a way in which I can train myself to be a humane person, just as by shaking hands and bowing, I might reveal a certain kind of humaneness to others. When it comes to the practice of ritual, Master Yo said, it is harmonious ease that has to be valued. If you merely stick rigidly to ritual in all matters, great and small, there will remain that which you cannot accomplish. Yet if you know enough to value harmonious ease, but try to attain it without being regulated by the rites, this will not work either. In other words, when we practice ritual, one extreme that we might go to is an overly kind of fastidious practice of ritual, where we stick to the ritual a little bit too rigidly. But for all that, if we try to go about our lives without ritual, if we're just trying to lead a life of harmonious ease without ritual, instead we'll have a kind of sloppy behavior in real life. So we need to practice what we might call etiquette as a way of becoming good and virtuous people and expressing goodness and virtue to others. Confucius then recommends another practice, daily reflection. Master Zheng said, "Every day I examine myself on 3 counts. In my dealings with others, have I in any way failed to be dutiful? In my interactions with friends and associates, have I in any way failed to be trustworthy? Finally, have I in any way failed to repeatedly put into practice what I teach?" In other words, at the end of every day, examine whether your conduct is going well or going badly and make corrections. Interpersonal comparison is another kind of reflection. The master said, when you see someone who is worthy, concentrate upon becoming their equal. When you see someone who is unworthy, use this as an opportunity to look within oneself. So other people can become mirrors by which we can assess our own behavior and try to live up to better models of behavior in our interactions with others. And ultimately, we need to keep the right focus if we want to be leaders. The master said, do not be concerned that you lack an official position, but rather concern yourself with the means by which you might become established. Do not be concerned that no one has heard of you, but rather strive to become a person worthy of being known. Ultimately, whether people know you and care about you is out of your control. The best you can do is to make yourself the sort of person who, when fortune is fortunate, is capable of acting well. We have a point now, I think, for some big picture comparisons. Socrates and Confucius emphasize different aims. Socrates, on the one hand, highlights the need to develop wisdom and virtue to guide one's decisions, counsel, and actions well. Self-cultivation requires philosophical dialogue, which reveals one's self-ignorance, moderates one's character, and encourages one to improve in wisdom and virtue. Confucius, on the other hand, highlights the need to develop wisdom and virtue to bring out the best in others. Self-cultivation may require dialogue. Confucius, after all, converses with his students. But self-cultivation, becoming a polished, beautiful character, requires the study of literature, ritual, music. It also requires reflection on one's conduct and how one's conduct compares with others. Still, both Socrates and Confucius think leadership requires wisdom and virtue. Hence, both emphasize the need for self-cultivation. In closing, then, I will end with a few points for reflection, some questions we might ask. I have not in this talk attempted to assess or evaluate the prescriptions that Socrates and Confucius offer, but I will end with some questions we might consider. The first is a practical question. Socrates and Confucius suggest that the task of becoming a leader requires a demanding process of self-transformative self-cultivation. Practically speaking, how might an aspiring leader pursue such self-cultivation in a modern-day setting? How, concretely, might the aspiring leader integrate the task of self-cultivation, as Socrates and Confucius specify it, into one's everyday activity? A potential worry. Socrates and Confucius spell out fairly demanding programs for rendering oneself fit for leadership. Are there specific recommendations too demanding, or are they realistically attainable by real people? An applied ESG question, for the heck of it. Leadership in addressing environmental, social, and governance concerns might seem to require one to offer advice or make assessments about matters of justice. To lead well, does one need to know what justice actually is? Is it sufficient to possess certain reliable opinions about justice, or to possess other resources? If so, what might those resources be? Then finally, a fundamental question. Are Socrates and Confucius right? Does leadership require wisdom, virtue, and self-cultivation? Or can the successful leader be successful without self-cultivation? Are there any examples of successful leaders who lack the qualities that Socrates and Confucius recommend? If so, on what resources do they rely? And how might Confucius and Socrates assess these possible counterexamples? I'd like to thank you for your time. Be good, and I look forward to the conversation that we have coming up.
Thank you very much, Professor Walker. It was an extremely insightful and interesting sharing. So, Professor Messel, please, you can take the stage.
Good evening, all my lovely students and also online audience. I'm very glad to be the discussant for this very thought-provoking session. Even I'm puzzled by all these reflection questions, and I'm amazed by how much overlap we have in terms of philosophical view about leadership and how me as a management scholar actually view leadership. So next, I'm going to share a few simple slides and share with you guys as a management scholar how we view leadership, especially in the context of ESG or virtuous leadership. So yeah, it's very interesting that Professor Walker actually mentioned two very important philosophers, ancient philosophers. And according to management scholars, actually, we try to integrate Western view and Asian view about what is virtuous leader. Okay, so we try to find some common traits that both philosophers share. And they think that as a virtuous leader, they should have actually these 5 common traits. So they integrate the views from Confucius and also Socrates. So they think that there are 5 common traits. The first one is courage. And the second one is temperance. Third dimension is justice, and then prudence and humanity. You may wonder, what are these? So before I elaborate further, actually, as Professor Walker mentioned, leadership, both of the Confucius and Socrates actually think that leadership requires self-cultivation, right? But a lot of people, before they become leaders, or when they become leaders, they lack of self-awareness. They don't know what they don't know, right? So before I elaborate what we view as virtuous leadership, I actually have an interesting tool, like a test, for you to gain some, as the first step for today's session, is to gain some awareness about yourself. Am I a virtuous leader? Am I courageous enough? What are the strengths I have? And what are the limitations I have to become a virtuous leader? So next I'm going to show you guys a self-diagnosis tool that you can just scan this QR code. It will take you like 1-2 minutes. It's a very short test. And then you will find out actually your score for each dimension. And please don't forget to take a snapshot of your final report. Then I will walk through what courage means. What does prudence require? Okay, now I will give you like 1-2 minutes just to scan the QR code and fill in this test by yourself. Okay, I see more people finish. Okay, good. Now you have a report of your virtuous leadership. What are the scores are higher than average? What are the scores lower than average? Now let's walk through what are each dimension mean. So courage, right? As you keep hearing this theme in Professor Walker's talk, leadership requires virtue and wisdom. So first, according to management scholar, we actually think that first dimension is courage. What does courage mean? For those who understand Chinese, courage actually means 勇气. Okay, courage means that as a virtuous leader, you actually need to do the right thing without fear. Without fear, go reject unethical conduct. That's courage, the first trait you have to have. And the second trait is temperance. What does temperance mean? In Chinese, it actually means 中庸. It means that you try to control your emotions, the strong emotions and the desires to satisfy only your self-interests. That is temperance. And then the third dimension is justice, as Professor Walker keep emphasizing and highlight for you guys. It's the justice. What is justice? So justice means that as a leader, virtuous leader, not only you need to recognize justice rules, but also protect it and also interpersonally treat your followers fairly. Okay, there's an interpersonal element of it. And then the fourth trait actually is prudence. Prudence is 智细致. So it means that as a leader, Professor Walker also emphasized that leaders can make better decisions than followers because you know more, and then that's why they give you the power to make decisions. So prudence means that as a leader, you need to do make the right choice, form the right judgments, and pursue the right goals for your followers and collective. And then the last dimension is humanity, is that as a virtuous leader, you need to be able to love and care your followers and people around you. These are the 5 universal traits that are antecedents that determine whether you are a virtuous leader. So take a look at your score and reflect. Think about which are the strengths that you would like to keep and what are the weaknesses that you want to improve. Okay. Then after I share about, your strengths and the weaknesses about virtuous leadership, then the question you probably have, so what? Okay, everybody needs to be virtuous and ethical, but we live in a business world. Where are the business leaders? What can it entail me, right? So next, I just want to address this question we always ask ourselves. Can we do well by doing good, right? Are company CSR firm performance, they conflict each other, or can they actually complement or enhance each other? So I dig in some literature and theories and big data empirical studies. Then I found out this relationship. Actually, virtuous leadership or ethical leadership can enhance firm performance. It has tangible outcome for you guys. Why? This is not a relationship that I just claim. It's based on big data and empirical research results. So you may wonder why being ethical virtuous can actually enhance firm performance. These are the whys that established in our literature, in our studies, is that indeed virtuous ethical leaders can make better strategic choices and decisions. And they also enhance employees' commitment, trust towards you, motivate them better. They become more engaged and the productivity become better. Then of course, firm performance become better. And they also establish external legitimacy, and your company has a positive branding, right? Positive image. And leaders who are ethical and virtuous, they're more like to embrace triple bottom line. They weigh in balance the people, planet, and profit. And these are all the channels and the mechanisms that channel virtuous leadership towards your tangible firm performance. And then ethical leadership or virtuous leadership also leads to corporate social responsibility. That's obvious, right? Being ethical, then still, I want to explain why. What are the mechanisms that actually are responsible to explain this, right? So as an ethical or virtuous leader, you actually can more prioritize collective interest over self-interest, as we emphasized. As an ethical leader, you always just highlight more collective interest. And then you naturally want to frequently communicate ethical standards and justice rules. And also employees, through role modeling you, they initiate more ethical behaviors. Because of all these mechanisms, it's channeled to more CSR behaviors by your company. And then most important relationship I want to reveal to you guys is that CSR by the company actually has a positive effect on firm performance. And I looked into a recent study, meta-analysis compiled over 20 studies, look at East Asian companies. And what they found is that when company has CSR initiatives, behaviors, it actually enhances firm performance by 16%. It is not a small number. It's not a small effect size. And why? It's because it can actually mitigate your company's risks, especially in current society, current environment. And you can actually have more access to resources such as human resources, social resources, and access capital at a cheaper cost. And then stakeholder relationships, of course, is much better. And then you gain much more market share because your customers like you, and better government relations. So all of these are the channels that can help channel the corporate social responsibility towards your firm performance, profit, tangible outcomes. So by summarizing what our management scholars have found established quantitatively is that actually corporate social responsibility or being ethical, virtuous leader can help you guys yield tangible outcome as well. It's not either or. So through as a discussant, what I want to highlight on the base building up on Professor Walker's work is that I want to encourage you guys to be ethical, to be virtuous, not only because it's good to look at, it's also because it has tangible outcomes. Okay, thank you. So then I would like to give your audience a chance to ask some questions. Let me see if...
I see a question from Dimitrios Patounas for Prof. Walker. Do social media push leaders to become worthy to be known? Or do they give a way or a shortcut for one to become well-known without being worthy of being well-known? So the social media environment, you might think, might incentivize people to be flamboyant and flashy and emotionally engaging, but not necessarily virtuous, right? I have to say, I'm not all that familiar with media studies and how all of the incentives work, but speaking as a mere layman, it does seem as if the social media landscape does often provide the wrong incentives. And so this might be a certain kind of worry. Plato, who wrote, again, these dialogues about Socrates, was especially concerned in his own period in ancient Athens about the effects of what was probably the equivalent of the mass media in his own age, namely tragedies and comedies and public dramatic performances. So he seemed to think that those kinds of dramatic performances present us with enticing images, enticing pictures, but might actually lead us astray from truth and from the way things really are. It might be a worry that we have today when we look at, say, the social media landscape, that people pass along emotionally gripping and emotionally engaging articles and factoids, but that might end up having certain deleterious consequences. Certain business leaders, I suppose, might also be more famous for being flamboyant personalities than for actually having the right stuff. So perhaps the social media landscape does have those incentives, but I'm not sure whether there are countervailing incentives. Maybe Prof. Zheng has something to say about that.
We have another question to both Professor Walker and me. What did you learn from philosophy that is memorable, had an impact on your life? That's a very, Professor Walker.
Oh gosh, all of it. So just to give you a bit of background, well, so I was interested in philosophy when I was an undergraduate, and after I graduated, I was still interested in philosophy because it seemed addressing very deep and important questions about how to live. And for many years, I worked in the media business in New York City. I was in book publishing for about 7 years. But I found that philosophy and the questions it asks really gripped me. So after 7 years, I moved to a graduate program to study philosophy full time. And so far, I haven't been able to get it out of my system. I think the sorts of questions philosophy asks are questions that are ultimately unavoidable. And so that's one great thing about philosophy, is that it gives you an opportunity to explore with people who've asked very deep questions. It gives you an attempt to ask those questions and see how some people have responded to those questions. And in the world today with the internet, there are all these fantastic podcasts and books and websites. Philosophy, I think, has become more accessible than it has been before. And so if you're interested in philosophy, there are lots of resources available to you for free for pursuing these questions further.
Thank you. Then it also addressed to me, then I will answer that. So since all the PhD is called philosophy of doctor, right? So actually what I realized is that through my research towards the end, the answers to the questions are always connected to philosophy. So that's my realization. And I think what I feel most is Professor Walker just now, the presentation mentioned leaders, you don't need to be ready or need to be in that position to force it. You just be yourself and be the role model, be virtuous, and the people will attract to you. And then they will see you as a role model. So instead of being very cultivating it forcefully, you just be that role model and be virtuous. That's what I try to embody that from the philosophy as well. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions from students and the audience?
Oh, there are two big questions. There's a short one from Lenny Petri. Why do so many leaders, so-called leaders, lead the world without having the virtues of Socrates? Maybe because they have a certain kind of charisma, might be a kind of surface charisma. They might have a certain kind of rule-breaking attitude, which might be consistent with being virtuous, but is not necessarily accompanied by virtue. I mean, I suppose there are all sorts of reasons. They have good PR, you know. So sometimes virtues are not always fully manifest. And so perhaps that is one reason some people who are virtuous do not end up becoming leaders. There's a funny exchange in a Platonic dialogue where Socrates says that the sign that somebody is probably a good leader is that they don't want to be in the position of leadership. often people who are aspiring leaders often are aspiring leaders for the wrong reasons, maybe to satisfy their desire to rule or to have power over other people, which is not necessarily a virtuous motivation.
Thank you. I see next question by Dimitrios actually addressed to me that to paraphrase Adam Smith, it's not from the benevolence of the leader that we expect our planet to improve, but from their regard to their own self-interest, we address ourselves. Not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. That's first. And then being corporately, socially responsible may give firm performance, but pretending to give, CSR may also give firm performance at a lower cost. There's a risk for us that there may be incentives to be socially responsible, but even stronger ones to be unresponsible and simply pretend to be. There's two questions. So I will answer first. If Professor Walker has some responses, please share with us. I'm also interested to hear that. So the first question is actually addressing the lecture I teach about motivation, right? People are motivated by different things. So if for some leaders, they change the world really not because they just want to be responsible. It's because they're entrepreneurial and they're motivated by taking advantages, risk taking, all this. People have different drives that motivate them. So I think partially that is correct. And if you, from a communication perspective, we always say that we need to speak others' language to get others to do things that achieve a collective best, right? So in order to motivate your leaders, of course, if you emphasize, if that leader is more type like a transactional leader, then you need to motivate him by saying things that he cares, right? Instead of just say you need to look at big picture, you need to have a purpose, you need to be socially responsible. But if you talk to that leader in a way that, hey, if you don't be socially responsible, then the firm performance will be bad and you may not secure yourself as a leader. That's a language you speak so that you can get him to work, but it's still towards a better goal. Speaking of that, so be pretending to be socially responsible, there are actually research or studies to show that if companies pretend to do that, people can see, okay? People can just sense that, can interpret key messages and see it as inauthentic. That still, in the long run, it has negative consequences. So I urge companies or leaders try to be authentically, socially responsible. That's my answer. So Professor Walker, do you have any thoughts?
I would probably just concur with the points you've made. I would just point out that the question is asking a question that Plato, again, is deeply concerned with. What reason do we have actually to be virtuous rather than merely to seem virtuous? This is a question that is a central problem of one of Plato's most famous dialogues about Socrates, the Republic. And you have a whole discussion about why one is better off being just rather than merely seeming just. There's a lot to say about Plato's answer to that question, but I think the considerations that Prof. Zheng raises are right. You can fool most of the people some of the time, but ultimately the real character of your firm and your leadership will come to light in some way or other. Even if the particular choices that you're making as a leader are obscured and you're able to cover them up, ultimately the direction which you're leading your company is going to have the repercussions and results. And so that would give you some kind of reason actually to make good decisions rather than to make the semblance or mere appearance of good decisions.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so now let's, from WeChat audience, what kind of Chinese leadership will bring to the best leadership of the world?
I'll leave that to you, Prof. Zheng.
well, being to the best, if this question means that what is the Chinese leadership that is effective? Actually, I'm currently doing a research about paternalistic leadership. That is like be benevolent, but also being exert some rules and punishment or monitor how your followers develop. Right. So I think this is a famous Chinese style leadership that has been proved to lead to a lot of effectiveness, like employees' performance, enhance the performance, and also their identification with the leader. That's what I found out. The paternalistic leadership actually can enhance leaders followers identify with leaders. So that's this question. And then the next question from WeChat. What if a leader is put in a position to lead an organization when the leader is without proper experience in this field? That's back to Professor Walker's competence and ability.
Yeah, I think, well, here I think Socrates would say that if you don't have the expertise, you're apt to make a mess of things. So if you find yourself in this position, you would do best probably to have advice from other people who might be competent in the areas where you lack expertise. And so maybe you have a brain trust where you can consult people. I guess there's a question of how you ended up in this leadership position as well. That would be another thing that we would need to ask. But yes, you would want to rely on the expertise of other people to make up for what you yourself lack.
Yeah, like Professor Walker also mentioned, Confucius said that you actually wu wei, right? You actually inspire others so that you can leverage others' expertise and then achieve the common goal, collective goal. Yes. Right. Frederick, you raise your hand. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering first for Professor Walker, do you think Confucius or Socrates would be successful business leaders today? Would they be wealthy or could they make it? And for Professor Michelle, what about office politics? It seems today you need relationships to get to the top, and then finally you can start doing virtuous things. What's your opinion on that?
You raise a good question. I would say the particular characters, Socrates and Confucius, would probably not be the best business leaders, if only because they had such strong personal vocations. They had such strong callings to explore these questions that I think all of their time was spent with these questions, trying to offer answers to them about the question, what is virtue, what is wisdom, how should we lead our lives? I think they would see nothing wrong with being a good business leader, and they would be happy to offer advice, but probably they would recognize that their own interests and talents and skills might lie in other areas. And so again, knowing what they know and what they don't know, they might leave it open to other people who have better skills and expertise in the area of management. But still, they would be happy maybe to serve in a kind of consulting function. I think that might be. So you could imagine maybe Socrates or Confucius working for, well, a certain kind of consulting firm, maybe not the way consulting firms operate today. And I would say actually some philosophers in the current day do some consulting with organizations and with companies on these questions. So perhaps they might find a role for their insights in that capacity.
Right. It reminds me of the Three Dynasty, the history in China, that Zheng is actually it's a very good consultant for them, right? Okay, then the very controversial question about office politics and then going on the top and then being virtuous. It's so dramatic and vivid. I already have this picture of that. You have to be really dark and then achieve what you have to achieve, and then you start to look at the big pictures and like kind of how do you say, restore your justice or ethical image, be virtuous. That image is very vivid, portrayed by Frederick. So I think my answer to this, if it's from leadership's perspective, we mentioned how to navigating the office politics is that you need to differentiate influence and manipulation, right? So in order to navigate your politics in the office, you of course need to nudge people and influence people. But how do you maintain that you can sleep in the night and you find yourself still ethical? Is that you need to know that thin line of manipulation and influence. You can influence others, motivate others to get things done that benefit to you and him, herself, but don't manipulate others so that you can achieve something beneficial only to yourself. I think that's how you maintain conscious, maintain your virtual, and then when you climb on the top, you can still do good things with clean consciousness. So that's my advice. Imagine Kongzi using TikTok, people would not be able to accept his thoughts. Similar question to the, similar to Frederick, they also think that they kind of wonder what Confucius would be like in today's modern society. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting questions.
Yes.
Professor Walker, thanks so much. It was a very insightful route to the ancients, and I think it's a very nice reflection of a sentence that you said, that Socrates said, of worthy of being known. And I think that as Professor Misal continued, that by being worthy known, you will become an authentic leader in the end. So thank you so much for your sharings. They were very, very insightful. Thank you very much all the audience, both in Zoom and with chat. We had a great audience today. And on behalf of the Social and Impact Responsibility Club, I would like to immensely thank you for participating in our first day's event.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.